Why avoidant is ignoring you, and yet the silence feels louder than words, heavier than rejection, and strangely more confusing than an actual goodbye. Because what you're dealing with doesn't fit into the normal rules of connection, and the mind keeps trying to solve it like a puzzle that was never designed to have a clean answer. One moment there was warmth, consistency, even emotional closeness that felt like it was building into something real, and the next moment it's as if someone quietly stepped back into a different world without explaining why. No argument, no closure, just distance. And the human brain hates this kind of emotional gap, so it fills it with assumptions. They lost interest. I wasn't enough. I did something wrong. When in reality, what looks like disinterest on the surface is often something far more internal, far more automatic, and far less about your value than your mind is currently willing to believe. If you've ever found yourself rereading messages, checking timestamps, or trying to decode silence like it's a hidden language, stay here, because what's really happening is not what it seems, and the story you've been telling yourself might be the most painful misunderstanding of all. And before we go deeper into this, if this kind of emotional confusion feels familiar, consider subscribing, because here, we don't just talk about relationships, we break down the psychology behind them in a way that finally makes sense of the chaos. The first mistake most people make when they get ignored by someone with avoidant tendencies is assuming the absence of communication equals absence of care, as if emotional availability and emotional expression are always synced in real time. But human attachment doesn't work that cleanly. What feels like being ignored is often the result of an internal shutdown, not an external decision to discard someone. The painful irony is that the more meaningful the connection feels to the other person, the more intense the internal pressure can become when things start moving too close, too fast, or too emotionally real. And instead of communicating that pressure, they often do something simpler, almost automatic. They create space. Not because they stopped caring, but because their nervous system is trying to regulate something they don't fully know how to explain. Meanwhile, the person on the receiving end experiences that space as rejection, because silence naturally translates into emotional loss when you're still engaged and open. This mismatch is where the confusion begins, where overthinking takes root, and where a simple shift in internal emotional processing gets misread as a change in heart. To understand this more clearly, you have to zoom into the psychology behind avoidant attachment and keep it simple, because it's not about labels or diagnosing people, it's about patterns. At its core, avoidant attachment is often built around a deep association between emotional closeness and a loss of internal control. So when intimacy increases, even in healthy and natural ways, their system doesn't always register it as comfort, it registers it as pressure. Not pressure from the other person, but pressure inside themselves, like something tightening emotionally that they don't fully know how to release. And when the nervous system senses pressure without a clear coping mechanism, it tends to default to distance. This is where the disconnect forms. One person leans in for reassurance, clarity, or connection, while the other instinctively leans back just to feel stable again. Neither is necessarily trying to hurt the other, but both are responding to completely different emotional survival settings. And that's why the silence doesn't match the story you're telling yourself about disinterest, because in their internal world, they are not necessarily detaching from feelings, they are detaching from intensity. And here's where it gets even more confusing. Avoidant behavior rarely starts as distance. It usually begins with connection that feels surprisingly strong, even intense at times, which creates a sense of safety for the other person. But as emotional familiarity grows, something subtle shifts inside them. It's not dramatic, it's not obvious. It's more like an internal alarm that doesn't make noise but changes behavior. They start needing more alone time, replies become slower, energy becomes inconsistent, and suddenly the emotional rhythm that once felt steady begins to fracture. From the outside, it looks like fading interest, but internally it's often the exact moment where emotional activation has reached a level they haven't learned how to stay present in. And instead of communicating that discomfort, they withdraw into silence, not as a statement about you, but as a coping mechanism for themselves. This is the part most people never get told, and why so many end up chasing clarity from someone who is not actually making a conscious decision to confuse them. They are simply reacting to internal overwhelm. And the most painful layer in all of this is what happens to the person being ignored. Because when communication stops, the mind doesn't sit in neutral, it starts building narratives. You start replaying conversations, analyzing tone shifts, searching for the exact moment things changed, as if there must be a single identifiable mistake that caused the distance. But what if there wasn't one? What if the shift wasn't triggered by something you did wrong, but by something they felt internally that had nothing to do with your worth? That idea is difficult to accept because it removes the illusion of control. If it wasn't your fault, then you can't fix it by overthinking or adjusting yourself. And that's where the emotional discomfort really sits, not in their silence, but in the uncertainty it forces you to sit with. And that uncertainty is exactly where the push-pull cycle begins to take shape, almost like an invisible rhythm that neither person consciously agrees to, yet both get pulled into anyway. Because once silence enters the space, the emotional dynamic doesn't just pause, it shifts. The person who feels the distance starts reaching for clarity, trying to close the gap through messages, questions, or emotional expression, while the one who feels overwhelmed by closeness begins to retreat further, not out of strategy, but out of instinct. And what makes this cycle so emotionally exhausting is that it creates the illusion that movement is happening when in reality, both people are simply reacting to each other's nervous systems. One steps forward to reconnect, the other steps back to stabilize, and suddenly connection becomes a rhythm of pursuit and withdrawal that never fully lands anywhere safe. From the outside, it looks like mixed signals, but from the inside, it feels like survival versus longing colliding in real time. And the more intense the pursuit becomes, the more pressure the avoidant system feels, and the more withdrawal increases, creating a loop that can quietly stretch for weeks or even months without resolution. This is why their silence is not the same as loss of interest, even though it feels identical when you're on the receiving end of it. Interest is a conscious decision, something stable and linear, but avoidant withdrawal is often an unconscious regulation process. It doesn't always reflect a conclusion about the relationship, it reflects a temporary attempt to lower emotional intensity. And that distinction changes everything, because it means the absence of communication is not necessarily a message about your value, but a reflection of their internal capacity in that moment. The hardest part is that silence leaves no translation key. You don't get context, you don't get explanation, you just get space, and the human mind is not built to sit comfortably inside unanswered emotional space. So it fills in the blanks with the most emotionally available story, which is usually rejection. But in many cases, what's happening is not a decision to leave, but a decision to retreat inward until emotional pressure feels manageable again. The exact moment this withdrawal begins is rarely dramatic. It doesn't usually come from a fight or a clear rupture. More often, it's something subtle that shifts the internal emotional load. It could be a moment of perceived expectation, a slight increase in emotional dependency, or even just the quiet realization that things are becoming meaningful in a way that feels unfamiliar or intense. To someone with avoidant tendencies, meaning itself can sometimes feel like weight, not because they don't value connection, but because they've learned often early in life that emotional closeness comes with a loss of autonomy or control. So when the relationship crosses an invisible threshold, their system doesn't negotiate, it reacts. And that reaction is withdrawal. Not a calculated decision, not a rejection of the other person, but an instinctive step back to restore internal balance. And while that is happening internally, externally, the change can feel sudden, even cold, because what once felt like warmth is now being filtered through distance. What makes this even more complicated is the way people unintentionally intensify the cycle without realizing it. When someone starts feeling ignored, the natural response is to seek reassurance, to increase communication, to try to restore what felt lost. But in this specific dynamic, those efforts can land differently than intended. Not because they are wrong or excessive, but because they arrive at a moment when the other person is already managing emotional overload. So what feels like connection seeking to one person can feel like pressure to the other. And that pressure doesn't get processed as logic, it gets processed as sensation, as discomfort, as the need to step back further. This is where both people start feeling misunderstood. One feels abandoned, the other feels overwhelmed, and neither side feels seen accurately by the other. And then comes the most deceptive part of all of this dynamic, the illusion of emotional coldness. Because from the outside, withdrawal looks like detachment. It looks like indifference, like emotional shutdown, like someone simply no longer cares. But internally, it is often the opposite of indifference. It is emotional activation without emotional expression. The feelings don't necessarily disappear, they become compartmentalized, stored. held at a distance so they don't overwhelm the system. That's why avoidant withdrawal can look calm on the surface while internally being anything but calm. And this is where so many misunderstandings are born, because people assume emotional silence equals emotional absence. But silence can also be emotional containment, not emotional rejection. The problem is you never get to see the difference from the outside. You only feel the impact of it. And that impact is exactly what pulls you into the silence phase. The part where everything feels suspended, like the relationship didn't end, but it also didn't continue. It just froze mid-emotion, leaving you standing in a space that still feels alive with memory, but completely empty in response. This is where the mind starts doing the heaviest work, because without communication, it becomes responsible for building meaning out of absence. You start replaying the last moments of interaction with almost forensic detail, trying to find the hidden signal you missed, the subtle shift in tone, the message that might have carried double meaning, as if understanding it perfectly will somehow reverse the silence. But what's actually happening in their internal world during this phase is not always visible or linear. There's often a kind of emotional compartmentalization taking place, where feelings, memories, and connection are not erased but temporarily stored away from active emotional awareness, so the system can regulate itself. And from the outside, that storage looks like disappearance, but internally, it's more like emotional distancing from intensity, rather than emotional deletion of the bond. This is also the phase where the biggest myth gets activated in your mind, the one that says if someone truly wanted you, they would never leave you in uncertainty. It sounds logical, almost clean in its simplicity, but it doesn't account for the complexity of internal emotional regulation. Desire and capacity are not always aligned in real time. Someone can feel connection and still struggle with how to stay present inside it. But when you're on the receiving end of silence, logic rarely wins against emotional interpretation. The nervous system reads absence as danger, not nuance. So instead of seeing a regulation process, you see rejection. Instead of seeing overwhelm, you see replacement. And that interpretation becomes so emotionally convincing that it starts to override everything else, even when their past behavior showed genuine engagement and consistency. This is where emotional reality becomes distorted, not because you're irrational, but because silence removes the context needed to interpret it accurately. And then something else starts happening, something even more emotionally sticky, especially in dynamics like this, the addiction to inconsistency. When someone is warm one moment and distant the next, your brain doesn't process it as neutral interaction. It starts tracking the contrast. The highs feel higher because of the lows, and the lows feel more confusing because of the highs. This creates a psychological loop where you begin to focus more on the return of connection than the stability of it. So even when silence hurts, it also creates anticipation, a quiet expectation that maybe the next message will reset everything. And without realizing it, you start building emotional investment not just in the person, but in the possibility of their return. This is where chasing becomes emotionally reinforced, not because you want pain, but because your system starts associating inconsistency with emotional significance. And eventually, something even more disorienting happens. They come back. Sometimes like nothing happened, sometimes with minimal explanation, sometimes with energy that feels almost identical to before the silence. And this return can feel relieving, even euphoric in a way, because it temporarily resolves the uncertainty. But it also creates a deeper layer of confusion, because now the story resets without resolution. There's no closure on the silence, no understanding of the withdrawal, just a re-entry into connection that feels familiar but slightly unstable. And this is where the cycle quietly resets itself, because when someone returns without fully processing what caused the distance, the emotional system doesn't learn a new pattern, it just repeats the old one with slightly different timing. So connection builds, pressure increases, withdrawal happens again, silence returns again, and the loop continues. But underneath all of this repetition, there is a subtle shift that starts to occur, especially when the other person begins to notice patterns instead of reacting purely to moments. Over time, the dynamic begins to change not because of confrontation or explanation, but because of emotional pacing. When the intensity of pursuit slows down, when reactions become less immediate, when emotional energy is no longer fully invested in closing every gap, something interesting happens in the dynamic. The space that once felt overwhelming begins to feel less pressured, not because the underlying attachment style has changed overnight, but because the emotional environment has become less activating. And in that space, perception can slowly begin to shift. Not instantly, not dramatically, but in small recalibrations where the relationship is no longer experienced as something that demands escape, but something that can exist without immediate pressure. And when that emotional pressure starts to ease, even slightly, the entire dynamic begins to reveal something that was always there underneath the chaos, something most people miss because they are too focused on the silence itself, rather than what the silence was responding to. Because in many cases, what actually changes the avoidant experience of connection is not persuasion, not emotional intensity, and not repeated attempts to prove value, but the absence of pressure that their nervous system had begun associating with closeness. And when that pressure is no longer constantly reinforced, the relationship stops feeling like an emotional demand and starts feeling more like an open space again. That doesn't instantly create deep vulnerability or sudden emotional transformation, but it does shift the internal temperature of the interaction. And in psychology, especially in attachment patterns, even small shifts in perceived emotional safety can change how someone engages over time. This is where the idea of power shift gets misunderstood. It is not about control, manipulation, or winning someone back. It is about emotional self-regulation becoming visible in the dynamic. When someone is no longer reacting from urgency, when their communication is no longer driven by anxiety or the need to fix silence immediately, the entire relational field changes shape. Because now, instead of one nervous system escalating and the other withdrawing, there is a reduction in mutual activation. And in that reduction, something unexpected can happen. The avoidant system no longer feels the same need to escape the moment connection appears. Not because fear is gone, but because it is no longer being amplified. And this is a critical distinction, because avoidant behavior is often less about the presence of love and more about the intensity at which love is experienced internally. When intensity drops, tolerance increases. When urgency disappears, space becomes less threatening. But even here, there is a subtle danger in misinterpreting progress, because emotional distance being handled better does not automatically mean emotional availability has fully changed. It simply means the system is not being pushed into overload. And that difference matters, because without understanding it, people can start confusing reduced withdrawal with full emotional alignment. Real change in attachment patterns is slow, often inconsistent, and deeply internal. It is not a switch that flips when someone feels less pressured. It is a gradual rewiring that happens through repeated experiences of safety without overwhelm. And if that process does not occur, old patterns can return the moment emotional intensity rises again. That is why the healthiest perspective is not to treat behavior change as a guarantee, but as information about how connection is currently being experienced, moment by moment. At this point, something else becomes more important than decoding the other person's behavior, and that is how you are relating to emotional uncertainty itself. Because the real turning point in dynamics like this is not when the other person changes, but when you stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying to understand them. When you are no longer chasing silence for answers, when you are no longer measuring your worth through response time, when your emotional state is no longer completely dependent on whether someone is present or absent in a given moment, the entire emotional loop begins to lose its grip. Not because the situation is solved, but because it no longer controls your internal world in the same way. And that is where emotional power actually shifts, not externally, but internally, in the way attention is distributed away from uncertainty and back towards stability within yourself. And from that space, the final truth becomes much clearer, even if it is not immediately easy to accept. The silence was never a clean statement of disinterest, but it also was never just random confusion without meaning. It was a response to internal experience that did not have the language to be expressed cleanly in real time. But on the receiving end, what matters most is not just understanding the psychology, it is recognizing the pattern it creates in you. Because whether someone withdraws out of fear, overwhelm, or emotional limitation, the effect on your nervous system still matters. Confusion still drains you. Inconsistency still impacts your sense of stability. And waiting for clarity that never arrives still takes a cost. So the deeper wisdom here is not about excusing or condemning the behavior, but about seeing it clearly enough to stop interpreting it as a reflection of your worth. And if there is one final layer to take from all of this, it is that emotional silence does not always mean emotional absence, but it also does not automatically mean emotional alignment is healthy or sustainable for you. Both things can be true at the same time. Someone can care and still not show up consistently. Someone can feel deeply and still not have the capacity to hold closeness in a steady way. And once that becomes clear, the question stops being, how do I make them understand me? And slowly becomes, what kind of emotional reality do I actually want to live inside? Because at the end of the day, clarity is not just about understanding why someone is ignoring you. It is about understanding what you are willing to keep repeating in the name of trying to be understood.